The strangest German occupation of Britain did not begin with parachutes, tanks, or invasion barges. It began after Germany had already lost. By the summer of 1945, Hitler was dead. Berlin was broken. The war in Europe was over. British families were trying to breathe again after 6 years of blackouts, bombing raids, ration books, and telegrams no one wanted to receive. But across Britain, behind fences and barbed wire, hundreds of thousands of German soldiers were still there. They were not marching through London. They were prisoners. Men captured in North Africa, Italy, France, and the final collapse of Germany. Some had been hardened by war. Some were barely adults. Some still believed in the cause that had dragged Europe into hell. Others were staring at defeat and wondering what kind of home was left to return to. And here is the part most people never hear. When the time came for them to leave, thousands did not want to go. They had come to Britain as the enemy. They stayed long enough to become something Britain never expected. Workers, neighbors, husbands, fathers, and quiet pieces of a post-war story many families kept almost hidden. This is not a story about excusing Nazi Germany. It is about what happened after the guns went silent, when bombed Britain found itself feeding German prisoners, guarding them, working them, and in some cases, accepting them. If forgotten WWII stories like this pull you in, stay with me, because this one begins with victory, but it quickly turns into something far more uncomfortable. In 1940, the idea of German soldiers living quietly in British villages would have sounded insane. Britain had feared invasion. Coastal towns watched the sea. The sky over southern England filled with aircraft, smoke, and fear. But war twists every expectation. At first, the German prisoners held in Britain were small in number. They were often pilots, aircrew, or naval men whose war had ended early. Many prisoners were sent far away to other parts of the British Empire, where escape seemed harder. Then the war turned. After D-Day in June 1944, the flood began. As Allied armies pushed through France and into Germany, German soldiers surrendered in huge numbers. Britain suddenly had to solve a problem victory itself had created. Where do you put so many enemies once they are no longer on the battlefield, while your own country is exhausted and short of workers? By 1946, more than 400,000 German POWs were held across Britain, spread across farms, old military sites, open fields, and camps built or adapted in a hurry. A village might wake up and learn that a camp nearby now held men who just months earlier had worn the enemy uniform. For many British people, this was personal. They had lived through the Blitz. They had lost family, friends, and neighbors. Some had watched homes burn. So when German prisoners appeared in the countryside, the reaction was not simple kindness. It was suspicion, anger, curiosity, fear. And inside the camps, Britain had to face another problem. Not every prisoner thought the same way. Some were tired of war. Some were still loyal to Nazi ideas. The fences held bodies, but the harder fight was over what these men would believe when they finally returned to Germany. Then came the emergency outside the fences. The country needed food. The war had drained manpower. Farms needed hands. Fields still had to be worked. Crops still had to be gathered. Survival did not end just because Germany surrendered. So German prisoners were put to work. At first, the sight felt unreal. German POWs moving through British farmland, watched by guards, doing the hard rural labor that kept villages alive. These were not free men. They were prisoners under military control. But every day they worked, they also became more visible. A man who had once been only the enemy could now be seen carrying tools, lifting sacks, repairing fences, or harvesting crops outside town. That did not erase the war. It did not erase grief, but it changed the distance. Distance is powerful in wartime. It is easier to hate a uniform across the sea than a tired young prisoner standing in a muddy lane with the same hollow look every soldier gets after too much war. And that was where Britain's secret began to grow. Not in one dramatic moment, not in one official announcement, but in hundreds of small, awkward contacts between people who were supposed to remain enemies. A farmer saw a prisoner work hard and asked for him again. A guard realized not every German in the camp was the same. A local family heard that some prisoners had no real homes left, only bombed streets, dead relatives, or borders that had changed while they were away. The prisoners saw things too. They saw British homes that had been destroyed. They saw rationing still in place. They saw that victory had not made Britain rich or untouched. The country guarding them was also tired, scarred, and grieving. Both sides had reasons to hate. Both sides had reasons to stay distant. Yet the longer the prisoners remained, the more the simple wartime picture began to crack. By Christmas 1946, Something happened that would have seemed impossible during the Blitz. Some German prisoners were allowed into British homes. Not all of them, not everywhere, not without rules, but enough to mark a turning point. The enemy was no longer only behind wire. In some places, he was sitting at a table in a British house, sharing a holiday meal in a country his army had tried to break. For some people, that was mercy. For others, it felt like betrayal. And for the prisoners, it opened a question they could not ignore. If Britain, the enemy, could offer work, food, order, and sometimes even human kindness, what exactly was waiting back in Germany? That question would become dangerous. Because once a defeated soldier begins to wonder if the prison country feels safer than home, the war is no longer just a battlefield story. It becomes a human one. And Britain was about to discover that some of these German soldiers were not simply waiting to leave. They were starting to imagine staying. The first thing Britain learned was that victory could still feel dangerous. The war was over, but the country did not feel healed. Bomb sites still scarred cities. Food was still tight. Families still waited for men who would never come home. And now, in fields and camps across the country, Britain was holding the soldiers of the army that had helped cause all of it. Some British people wanted them gone as fast as possible. Others asked a harder question. If Germany was shattered, angry, hungry, and full of ruins, what would happen if hundreds of thousands of defeated soldiers were simply sent back with the same ideas that had brought Europe to disaster? That question turned the prison camps into something more than holding pens. They became a test. Britain did not just need to guard German prisoners. It needed to understand them. Inside the wire, the prisoners were not one single group. Some were convinced Nazis. Some had followed orders and now wanted nothing to do with politics. Some had been teenagers when the war swallowed their lives. Some were older men who had already seen too much death. And some were quietly anti-Nazi but afraid to say it out loud. That fear mattered, because in many camps, the strongest voices could be the most dangerous ones. Hardline Nazis could bully other prisoners. They could threaten men who spoke against Hitler. They could punish those who wanted to cooperate. Even after Germany had collapsed, the shadow of the regime still reached into the huts. So British officials began sorting prisoners by political attitude. The system was not perfect. Men could lie. Men could say what they thought guards wanted to hear. But the idea was simple. Separate the committed Nazis from the men who might be ready for a different Germany. For Britain, this was not just kindness, it was strategy. The next Germany had to be different, or the war's ending would only be a pause before the next disaster. So the prisoners were questioned, watched, and graded. Some were seen as safer, some were seen as uncertain, some were seen as still deeply tied to Nazi beliefs. And behind that process was a bigger effort, re-education. That word can sound soft, almost harmless. But for many prisoners, it was a direct attack on everything they had been taught. They had grown up under flags, uniforms, slogans, and fear. Some had been told since childhood that Germany was destined to rule. Some had been taught that democracy was weak. Some had been fed lies about the war, about Britain, about Jews, about Europe, and about their own leaders. Now the camps became places where those lies were challenged. Prisoners were given newspapers, lectures, books, and discussions. They were encouraged to learn English. Some were shown the reality of Nazi crimes. For men who had denied, ignored, or never fully understood what the regime had done, this could be a brutal shock. But no single film or lecture could clean a mind overnight. Some prisoners rejected it. Some stayed bitter. Some thought Britain was only trying to break them. Others listened quietly and said little. The change, when it came, was often slow. And then there were the young ones. They were among the most important. Many of them had known almost nothing except Hitler's Germany. They had been children when the Nazis took power. Their school, youth groups, songs, heroes, and fears had all been shaped by one system. When they were captured, they were not just defeated soldiers. They were young men with a future that had been stolen before they even understood it. Britain knew that if these men went home unchanged, they could help rebuild the same poison in new form. So some camps focused heavily on younger prisoners. The aim was not to make them British. It was to make them question what they had been told, to see democracy as something stronger than enemy propaganda, and to imagine a Germany that did not need another war to feel alive. But outside the classrooms, another kind of re-education was already happening. Work. Day after day, German prisoners stepped beyond the wire under control and went into the British countryside. They cut timber, dug ditches, gathered crops, repaired damage, lifted, carried, loaded, cleaned, and built. They did the unglamorous labor that countries need after war, when everything is short and everyone is tired. And the British public watched. At first, many saw only uniforms and remembered bombs. But over time, the uniform became less simple. A farmer could see which prisoner worked hard and which one caused trouble. A village child might see a PW smile or wave and feel confused because enemies were not supposed to look human. A widow might hate the sight of them and still know the farm needed hands. That was the uncomfortable truth of post-war Britain. The country needed these men, and because it needed them, it had to deal with them not as distant enemies, but as people living nearby. This created resentment. British workers were not always happy to see German prisoners doing paid or organized labor while Britain itself struggled. Families who had lost sons did not want to hear that former enemies were being treated decently. Some people asked why prisoners were still there at all. Others asked why they were not being sent home sooner. The government was under pressure from both sides. Keep them, and people accused Britain of using defeated men like forced labor. Send them home too fast, and Britain risked losing labor it badly needed, while also returning men who had not been screened, challenged, or prepared for a new Germany. There was no clean answer. And for the prisoners, the waiting became its own kind of punishment. Many had expected to go home when the war ended. Instead, months passed. Then more months. Letters were delayed. News from Germany came in pieces. Some learned their homes had been destroyed. Some heard that family members were dead or missing. Some no longer knew which zone of occupied Germany they belonged to. Germany was not simply defeated. It was divided, occupied, hungry, and uncertain. So when British civilians began to treat some prisoners with cautious decency, it created a feeling no one had planned. Not comfort exactly, not freedom, but a strange kind of safety. In Britain, the prisoners were watched, limited, and controlled, yet they had food, they had work, they had order. They could sleep without artillery. They could see fields growing instead of cities burning. And slowly, some began to wonder if the enemy country had given them more peace than their own country could. That was the secret forming under everyone's nose. The longer they stayed, the less simple the story became. A German prisoner might begin as a number on a camp list. Then he became the reliable worker on a farm. Then the quiet man invited for Christmas. Then the person someone's daughter noticed. Then the former enemy who did not seem so easy to hate anymore. Britain had won the war, but now it was facing something victory had not prepared it for. What happens when the enemy stays long enough to become familiar? And what happens when some of them decide that going home may be the one thing they fear most? By 1947, the fences were still there, but the war inside Britain was changing shape. The German prisoners were no longer just a problem for the army. They had become a problem for villages, churches, farms, families, and politicians. Every month they remained in Britain, the old rules became harder to hold. At the start, contact between prisoners and British civilians had been tightly controlled. That made sense in wartime. These men had fought for the enemy. Many British families had been bombed, wounded, or left grieving because of the war Germany had started. No one wanted German soldiers wandering freely through towns like nothing had happened. But life does not stay neat after a war. A farmer needed the same men back because they knew the land. A prisoner learned enough English to speak with workers around him. A guard began to recognize which prisoners were trouble and which were simply tired men trying to get through the day. A local church might see a chance for Christian forgiveness. A family might look at a young prisoner and see not a monster, but a boy who had been pulled into a war before he fully understood it. This did not mean Britain suddenly forgot. It did not mean everyone forgave. Some people stayed angry, and they had every reason. Their homes had been destroyed. Their sons had died. Their husbands had not returned. To them, the idea of German prisoners being invited into British homes felt wrong. It felt like the country was softening toward men who had worn the uniform of the enemy. That anger was real. But so was the other side. Many German prisoners were far from home, cut off from families, and unsure what they would find if they returned. Some had already received word that their towns were gone. Some learned that their parents or brothers were dead. Some no longer knew if their homes were in the same country they had left. Borders had shifted. Occupation zones had split Germany into pieces. The future did not look like peace. It looked like hunger, ruins, and blame. So Britain became something strange to them. It was still a prison country, but it was also stable. There was food, even if rationing was still hard. There was work, even if the work was exhausting. There were fields, routines, pay rules, camp canteens, letters, classes, and the slow return of normal life. For a man who had watched Europe burn, even a guarded routine could feel safer than freedom in a ruined homeland. Then came the relationships Britain did not know how to handle. A prisoner working on a farm might see the same people every week. A local woman might speak with him while he worked. A family might invite him for a meal after rules loosened. Friendships formed carefully, often under pressure and suspicion. In some cases, romance followed. That was where the story became explosive. For many British people, friendship was one thing. Marriage was another. A German prisoner marrying a British woman could feel like an insult to families still mourning British soldiers. Newspapers and local gossip could turn these cases into emotional battles. People asked how a woman could love a former enemy. Others asked whether a man should be judged forever by the uniform he had worn. There was no easy answer. Some prisoners had been loyal Nazis. Some had not. Some had believed the lies and later changed. Some had only followed the path set in front of them as teenagers. But to a grieving mother, those differences could feel meaningless. Her son was still dead. The German uniform still carried the weight of everything Hitler's war had done. And yet, the longer the prisoners stayed, the more these personal ties grew. Britain had never planned for this. The camps were supposed to hold enemies until they could be sent home. They were not supposed to create future British residents. But by now, German pedos had spent years inside the country. Some had learned the language. Some had proven themselves on farms. Some had built trust with employers. Some had fallen in love. Some had begun to see Britain not as the place that captured them, but as the place where their lives might begin again. At the same time, repatriation was becoming a painful issue. Many prisoners wanted to go home. They were tired of waiting. They felt punished long after the war had ended. Britain was under growing pressure to return them. Holding so many men after victory was hard to defend, especially when Germany needed labor to rebuild. But Britain still needed workers too. The country was short of manpower. Farms needed help. Food production mattered. The winter years after the war were not easy. The public had won the war but had not yet won comfort. Rationing continued. Homes needed rebuilding. The economy was under strain. So German prisoners stood in the middle of two broken countries. Germany needed them back. Britain still used their labor. And the men themselves were caught between duty, fear, memory, and the strange pull of a country they had once been ordered to hate. For some, the answer became clear only after they saw Germany again. When visits and returns began, some prisoners came face to face with the reality waiting for them. The Germany they remembered was gone. Cities were crushed. Families were scattered. Jobs were uncertain. Shame hung over everything. In some areas, the political future was frightening. Men who had survived the war now had to ask whether going home meant starting over in a place that no longer felt like home. That is when Britain's best-kept secret became even harder to ignore. Some German soldiers did not just become less eager to leave. They began looking for ways to stay legally. They wanted farm jobs. They wanted civilian status. Some wanted to marry. Some wanted a quiet life far away from the ruins and the guilt of Germany's defeat. Others may have simply wanted a second chance in a country where people had seen them work, change, and become more than a prisoner number. But this choice carried a heavy shadow. A German who stayed in Britain could never fully escape the question of who he had been. A British family who accepted him could be judged by neighbors. A woman who loved him could face whispers. A farmer who hired him could be accused of forgetting the war too quickly. And Britain itself had to decide what victory really meant. Was justice only punishment? Was peace only separation? Or could a country that had survived Hitler's bombs find room for some of the defeated men who no longer wanted anything to do with the world that had sent them to war? No one had planned for that question. But across Britain, one former enemy at a time, the question was already being answered. The most uncomfortable part of this story is that Britain did not hide the German prisoners because they were invisible. It hid them in plain sight. They were on farms. They were on roads. They were in work gangs, camps, church halls, and village events once the rules became looser. They were close enough for people to recognize their faces, but far enough from the national memory that the story almost slipped away. And by the late 1940s, Britain had to face the truth. Some of these men were no longer just waiting for a ship home. They were building lives. That did not happen cleanly. It did not happen without anger. And it did not happen because everyone suddenly agreed to move on. The war was still too fresh for that. German cities were in ruins, but British cities were scarred too. The dead had not come back. The ration lines had not vanished. The memories of air raids had not softened just because the enemy now held a shovel instead of a rifle. So when German POWs began shifting from prisoners into civilian workers, the reaction was mixed. Some farmers welcomed them. They already knew which men worked hard. In a country still short of labor, a reliable hand mattered. A prisoner who had spent months or years on the same land could become hard to replace. He knew the animals. He knew the fields. He knew the rhythm of the farm. But to others, this felt wrong. British men had died fighting Germany. British workers needed jobs. British families were still living with loss. Why should former German soldiers get a chance to stay, work, and start over in the very country their side had tried to defeat? That question did not have an easy answer. Because by now, Britain was not dealing with an army. It was dealing with individuals. That difference sounds small, but it changed everything. An army can be hated as one force. A prisoner can be judged by his number, his uniform, and his side of the war. But a man who spends 2 years working beside the same farmer, learning English, helping with harvests, and showing no sign of the old ideology becomes harder to place inside one simple box. Not innocent, not free from history, but harder to reduce to just the enemy. That was the emotional trap Britain found itself in. The country had every right to remember the pain Germany had caused, but it also had to decide what to do with men who were defeated, disarmed, screened, and in many cases changed by what they had seen and learned. For some prisoners, staying in Britain was not about comfort, it was about fear. Germany after the war was a place of hunger, rubble, occupation zones, missing people, and moral collapse. Men who had once marched for a powerful state returned to find that state gone. The Nazi promises had ended in ashes. Some towns had been bombed flat. Some families had been pushed from homes in the East. Some soldiers had no clear future except ruins and shame. Britain was not paradise. It was tired, rationed, and still grieving, but it was stable. There was work. There was law. There were farms that needed hands. There were people who, after enough time, might look at a former enemy and see a man trying to live quietly. That possibility became powerful, and once romance entered the story, the tension became personal. A British woman who wanted to marry a former German prisoner could face judgment from almost every direction. Her neighbors might whisper. Her family might object. People might ask whether she had forgotten the war. Some would never accept it, no matter what kind of man he had become. For the German man, love did not erase his past either. He might be accepted at one table and hated in the next street. He might work hard for years and still be remembered first by the uniform he once wore. He might try to build a future, but the war followed him like a shadow. That is what made these lives so complicated. Staying in Britain was not a clean escape. It was a second sentence of another kind. Every former POW who stayed had to live under the weight of suspicion. Every British family that accepted one had to carry questions from people around them. Every child born into these homes inherited a quiet piece of history that many families did not speak about loudly. And still, thousands stayed. That number matters because it proves this was not one strange case. It was a hidden chapter of the post-war world. These men had entered Britain as captives. By the end, many remained as workers and residents. Some married, some raised families, some kept their German past private. Some became part of rural communities where people knew the truth but did not always talk about it. For Britain, this was not the victory story people expected. Victory is supposed to feel final. The enemy surrenders. The prisoners go home. The good side returns to normal. The history books close the chapter. But real history rarely ends that neatly. Germany's defeat left behind millions of broken lives. Britain's victory left behind shortages, grief, and hard choices. And between those two damaged countries stood the German prisoners who had become useful, familiar, and sometimes wanted. That was the secret. Not that Britain forgot the war, not that Britain forgave everything, but that after the most destructive war in human history, some former enemies were allowed to cross a line that had once seemed impossible. They went from prison camps into British fields, from work gangs into village life, from numbers on a military record into names spoken at dinner tables. And the deeper this went, the harder it became to answer the question sitting underneath the whole story. When does an enemy stop being an enemy? Is it when he lays down his weapon, when his country surrenders, when he rejects the cause he served, when he works beside you, when he marries into your family? Or does the war mark him forever? Britain never gave one perfect answer. It answered slowly, unevenly, and village by village. Some people refused to accept these men. Some accepted them only after years. Some judged them by their actions after the war, not only by the uniform they had worn during it, and some never stopped feeling that the whole thing was too painful to forgive. That is why this story stayed quiet. It did not fit the clean version of WWII memory. It was not about tanks, beaches, bombers, or generals. It was about what happened after all of that, when ordinary people had to decide whether peace meant keeping hatred alive forever, or risking the dangerous work of letting the defeated become human again. But one final question remained. For the German soldiers who refused to leave, what did staying actually cost them? Because Britain gave them a future, but it could never give them a past they did not have to answer for. For the German soldiers who stayed, the war did not end with freedom. It followed them into every job interview, every church service, every family dinner, every quiet walk through a British village where someone still remembered the sound of bombers overhead. They could change clothes. They could learn English. They could marry, work, raise children, and grow old. But they could not erase the fact that they had arrived in Britain as prisoners from the army of Nazi Germany. That was the cost of staying. A man could become a good farm worker. He could become a loyal husband. He could become a father whose children spoke with British accents and knew him only as a quiet man who worked hard and said little about the past. But somewhere behind him was a uniform, a camp number, and a war that had shattered millions of lives. Some former prisoners spoke openly about it. Others buried it deep. Many families learned only pieces. A father had been German. He had been a prisoner. He had stayed after the war. But the full story often came out slowly, if it came out at all. That silence was not always shame. Sometimes it was survival. Post-war Britain did not love complicated memories. It liked clear ones. Britain had stood alone. Britain had endured the Blitz. Britain had helped defeat Hitler. Those things were true, and they mattered. But this story did not fit neatly beside them, because this story asked people to sit with a harder truth. Some of the men who once served in the enemy's army became part of the country they had been sent to fight. Not as conquerors, not as heroes, not as men whose past should be washed clean, but as defeated human beings who had to choose what kind of life came after disaster. By 1948, the great prisoner system in Britain was winding down. Repatriation moved forward. Camps closed or changed purpose. Men were sent back to Germany in large numbers. The long wait was finally ending. For many, return was the only thing they wanted. They went home to search for family, rebuild towns, and face the broken country their leaders had left behind. Some found relatives alive. Some found empty spaces where houses had once stood. Some had to start again in a Germany split by occupation and fear. But thousands chose another road. They applied to stay. Some became civilian workers. Some continued in agriculture. Some married British women. Some built families in the very land where they had once been locked behind wire. Around 25,000 German former prisoners are believed to have made Britain their home. That number is not just a statistic. It is thousands of private reckonings. Thousands of men trying to live under the shadow of a past they could not fully explain away. Thousands of British families deciding whether a person could be judged by what he became after the war, while still refusing to forget what the war had cost. And that is where the true weight of this story lives. Because Britain did not forgive Germany in one grand moment. It did not open its arms and say the pain was gone. The pain was not gone. The graves were still there. The ruins were still there. The ration books were still there. The memories were still there. But peace is not built only by treaties signed in official rooms. Sometimes it is built in colder, smaller places. A muddy farm field, a guarded work party, a church hall where people sit stiffly beside someone they were taught to hate, a kitchen table where a British family decides that a hungry young prisoner can share a meal, a marriage that neighbors whisper about, a child who grows up not fully understanding why their father never talks about the war. That is why this chapter remains so quiet. It was not the kind of story people knew how to tell. If you made the German prisoner too sympathetic, you risked insulting the dead. If you made him only a villain forever, you ignored the strange truth of what happened after defeat. So many people chose silence. They let the story live in family records, village memories, old campsites, and the hidden corners of post-war life. But silence does not make history less real. The German soldiers who refused to leave became living proof that the end of a war is not the same thing as the end of its consequences. A battlefield can go quiet in a day. A peace can take generations. For Britain, The presence of these former enemies forced a question no victory parade could answer. What do you do with the defeated when they are no longer armed, no longer powerful, and no longer far away? You can punish them. You can send them home. You can guard them. You can use their labor. But if they remain long enough, work hard enough, change enough, and become known by name, eventually the question becomes more personal. Can a man step out of the shadow of the uniform he once wore? The answer was never simple. Some could not. Some did not deserve trust. Some carried beliefs that had to be challenged, watched, and rejected. Nazi crimes were real, and nothing in this story softens them. But some men did change. Some saw the lies collapse. Some returned from war with nothing left but regret and the need to begin again. Some found in Britain not comfort, but accountability, work, and a future that demanded they become someone different. And Britain, scarred but still standing, made room for a small number of them. That is the secret. Not that Britain forgot, not that Britain excused, but that after years of bombing, death, fear, and hatred, parts of Britain still found a way to face the defeated enemy as human, without pretending the past had vanished. That may be the hardest kind of victory. Not the victory that destroys an army. The victory that refuses to let war decide what every human being must remain forever. The German soldiers who stayed behind did not leave a loud monument. They left quieter traces, surnames in phone books, families with mixed histories, old farms where prisoners once worked, villages where the enemy became a neighbor, and memories that were often spoken in low voices because they were too strange, too painful, and too human to fit inside the simple version of World War II. They arrived as captives from a defeated army. They stayed as men trying to rebuild themselves. And in doing so, they became one of Britain's most hidden reminders that when a war ends, history does not stop. It simply changes uniforms.